The whiskey burned her throat, but Penelope Darrow barely noticed as she slumped against the worn wooden counter of the general store, her aunt's harsh words still ringing in her ears like church bells on a Sunday morning. It was April 1876 in Lewiston, Idaho, and spring had come to the mountain territory with all the promise of renewal. Yet Penelope felt nothing but the weight of expectation crushing down on her 22-year-old shoulders. "You should count yourself lucky that Mr. Whitmore even looked at you twice," her Aunt Constance had said just that morning, her pinched face tight with disapproval. "A woman past 20 with no dowry to speak of cannot afford to be particular. You will accept his proposal when he makes it, and you will be grateful." Penelope set down the bottle she had been pretending to dust and stared out the window at Main Street. Gerald Whitmore was 53 years old, owned the bank, and had buried 2 wives already. He smelled of tobacco and desperation, and when he looked at her, she felt like livestock being appraised at market. But her aunt was right about one thing Penelope had nothing. Her parents had died of fever when she was 17, leaving her dependent on her father's sister, a woman who viewed charity as a burden and reminded Penelope of it daily. The bell above the door chimed, and Penelope straightened automatically, smoothing her simple brown dress. She expected one of the town ladies, perhaps Mrs. Henderson coming for more thread, or old Mr. Jacobson needing tobacco. What she did not expect was the mountain of a man who had to duck slightly to clear the door frame. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen in Lewiston. Most of the men in town were miners, merchants, or farmers weathered by work but still civilized, still soft around the edges. This man looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the narrow aisle between the shelves. His hair was dark brown, long enough to brush his collar, and shot through with glints of copper where the sunlight caught it. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the strong line of his jaw. His clothes were simple buckskin trousers, a dark wool shirt that strained against the muscles of his chest and arms, and worn leather boots that had seen countless miles of rough terrain. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were a startling shade of green, like pine needles after rain, and when they settled on her face, Penelope felt something shift in her chest, like the first crack in river ice at the start of thaw. "Help you?" She managed, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Need supplies," he said. His voice was deep and rough as if he did not use it often. "Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, ammunition for a Winchester, rope." Penelope nodded and began gathering items, hyper-aware of his presence as he moved through the store with surprising quiet for such a large man. She could feel him watching her, but it was not the calculating assessment of Gerald Whitmore. This was different. This made her skin warm and her hands slightly unsteady as she measured out the flour. "You are new to town," she said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "Passing through," he replied. "Maybe staying a while, depends." "On what?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Whether there is reason to stay." Penelope glanced up at him and found those green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She looked away quickly, focusing on tying the sack of flour. "Most people come to Lewiston for the gold." "Are you a miner, trapper, hunter? Whatever work needs doing in the mountains." He paused. "Name is Ethan Thorn." "Penelope Darrow," she said automatically, then wondered if she should have been so forward. Her aunt would have scolded her for speaking so freely to a stranger. "Penelope," he repeated, and the way he said her name, slowly, like he was tasting it, made something flutter low in her belly. Pretty name for a pretty woman. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That will be $4.30, she said quickly, totaling the supplies. Ethan Thorn paid without haggling, his calloused fingers brushing hers as he handed over the coins. The brief contact sent a shock up her arm that she tried desperately to ignore. "You work here every day?" he asked as he gathered his purchases. "Most days. My aunt owns the store." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Reckon I might need more supplies soon. Never know what a man might find himself needing." Then he was gone, ducking back through the doorway and out into the bright spring afternoon, leaving Penelope staring after him with her heart beating far too fast. That evening at dinner, Aunt Constance was in rare form. She had apparently heard from Mrs. Henderson, who had heard from the postmaster's wife, who had heard from someone else, that Gerald Whitmore was planning to propose to Penelope at the church social on Saturday. "You will wear your blue dress," Aunt Constance instructed, spooning watery stew onto Penelope's plate. "The one with the lace collar, and you will smile and be gracious when he asks to speak with you privately. This is your chance, Penelope. Your only chance, likely. A woman in your position cannot afford romantic notions." Penelope pushed the stew around her plate. "I do not love him, Aunt Constance." "Love," her aunt scoffed. "Love is for girls who have the luxury of choice. You are a poor relation with no prospects. Mr. Whitmore can provide for you. That is what matters. He is old enough to be my father, older. And you are old enough to know better than to be foolish. You will accept him, Penelope. I will not support you forever. If you refuse this proposal, you can find your own way in the world." The threat hung heavy in the air. Penelope knew her aunt meant it. Without support, without references, a single woman had few options in 1876. She could try to find work as a teacher, but the position in Lewiston was already filled. She could become a seamstress, but she had no capital to start such a business. The alternative was too grim to consider. She lay awake that night in her small attic room, staring at the rough wooden beams above her bed. The spring wind whistled through cracks in the walls, bringing the scent of pine and possibility. She thought of Gerald Whitmore's watery blue eyes and soft, moist hands. She thought of a life as his third wife, tending his house, warming his bed, grateful for the roof over her head and the food on her plate. Then, unbidden, she thought of Ethan Thorn. Of green eyes that looked at her like she mattered, of a voice that made her name sound like something precious. Of the strange, wild hope that had bloomed in her chest when he had suggested he might have reason to stay in Lewiston. She told herself she was being foolish. He was a stranger. He would leave. Even if he stayed, why would a man like that look twice at her? Plain Penelope, with her brown hair and ordinary face, with nothing to offer but a talent for figures and a stubborn streak her aunt deplored. But she fell asleep thinking of him anyway. Ethan Thorn came back to the store 3 days later. This time he needed soap, needles, thread, and lamp oil. Penelope tried to keep her hands steady as she wrapped his purchases. "You settled on whether you are staying?" she asked, cursing herself for the question even as it left her lips. "Still deciding," he said. Then, after a pause, "You know these mountains well." "I have lived here 5 years," she said. "Since my parents passed, I know the town and the nearby trails some, though I do not get out much." "Seems a shame," Ethan said quietly. "Woman like you trapped in a store all day." "It is honest work," she replied, though she heard the defensiveness in her own voice. "Did not say it was not." He leaned against the counter, and Penelope was intensely aware of how close he was, how she could see the individual threads in his shirt, the small scar above his left eyebrow. "Just seems like you were meant for something more than measuring out flour for gossipy old women." "And what would you know about what I was meant for?" The words came out sharper than she intended, born of frustration and fear and the uncomfortable truth in his observation. Ethan did not flinch. Fair question. I do not know you, but I have seen enough of the world to recognize when someone is wilting instead of growing. His green eyes softened. You have that look, like a wildflower someone planted in a too small pot. Penelope's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was someone worth understanding, worth seeing. Well, she managed, we cannot all live wild in the mountains. Some of us have responsibilities. Responsibilities, he repeated, or obligations people put on you. Before she could answer, the door chimed and Aunt Constance swept in, her sharp eyes immediately fixing on Ethan with suspicion. Penelope, Mrs. Miller needs help with her order. See to it immediately. Her aunt's tone brooked no argument, even though Mrs. Miller was perfectly capable of waiting. Yes, Aunt Constance. Penelope bobbed her head and moved toward the back of the store where Mrs. Miller was examining bolts of calico. She could hear her aunt's clipped voice. Your purchases are wrapped. That will be $2. Penelope did not hear Ethan's reply, but she felt his gaze on her as he left. And when she glanced back, he was looking at her through the window with an expression she could not quite read. That night, Aunt Constance was explicit in her warnings. That mountain man is not the sort you should be speaking with, she said, her knitting needles clicking furiously. Men like that are dangerous, uncivilized. They take what they want and leave destruction behind them. He was only buying supplies, Penelope said. And looking at you like you were something to purchase as well. I saw it. I am not blind. Aunt Constance's needles paused. Saturday is the church social. Mr. Whitmore will propose. You will accept. And you will forget about rough men with wild eyes. That path leads nowhere good for women like us. Women like us, Penelope thought bitterly. Women with no money, no family, no choices. Women who should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection came their way. Saturday arrived with perfect spring weather, the sky a brilliant blue and the air sweet with blooming wildflowers. Penelope wore the blue dress as instructed, though she felt like she was dressing for a funeral rather than a social. The fabric was worn thin in places, and the lace collar was starting to yellow, but it was the best she owned. The church social was held in the meeting hall next to the small white church that served Lewiston's faithful. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and someone had brought a fiddle. Children ran between the adults, shrieking with laughter, while the women clustered in groups, and the men discussed mining claims and politics. Gerald Whitmore found Penelope within minutes of her arrival. He wore a black suit that smelled of mothballs, and his thinning hair was slicked back with pomade. Miss Darrow, he said, executing a small bow that made his belly strain against his vest buttons. You look lovely this evening. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, she replied automatically. I wonder if you might take a turn with me outside, he said, offering his arm. Such a beautiful evening. Seems a shame to waste it indoors. This was it, Penelope knew, the moment her aunt had been pushing her toward. She saw Aunt Constance watching from across the room, her expression stern and expectant. She thought of her small attic room of the store, of the future stretching out before her like an empty road. She placed her hand on Gerald Whitmore's arm and let him lead her outside. They walked to the edge of the churchyard, where a small garden had been planted. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat several times, clearly nervous. Despite everything, Penelope almost felt sorry for him. He was not a cruel man, just a lonely one, looking for someone to fill the gaps in his life. Miss Darrow, Penelope, I will be direct, he said at last. I am in need of a wife. My house needs a woman's touch, and I find myself wanting companionship in my later years. You are a sensible young woman, hardworking and decent. I believe we could have a satisfactory arrangement. A satisfactory arrangement. Not love, not passion, not partnership. An arrangement like a business contract. I can provide well for you, he continued. You would want for nothing. A comfortable home, adequate clothing, food on the table. In return, I would expect you to manage my household, entertain my business associates when necessary, and provide me with companionship. He paused delicately. And perhaps, if God wills it, a child or two. Penelope felt nausea rise in her throat at the thought of this man touching her, claiming her body as part of their satisfactory arrangement. Mr. Whitmore, I am flattered, but before you answer, he interrupted, you should know that I have already spoken with your aunt. She believes this is an excellent match and has given her blessing. She mentioned that your situation is somewhat precarious, that her continued support is not guaranteed. His voice was gentle, but the threat was clear. I am offering you security, Penelope, safety. How many other offers do you think you will receive? The truth of his words stung because it was the same truth her aunt had been drumming into her head for weeks. She was 22, plain, poor. This might indeed be her only offer. I need time to think, she managed. Gerald Whitmore's expression tightened slightly. Of course, but do not take too long. I am a patient man, but my patience has limits. He patted her hand in what he likely thought was a reassuring gesture. I will call on you Wednesday for your answer. He led her back inside, and Penelope immediately excused herself, claiming a headache. She could not bear the knowing looks from the other women, the satisfied expression on her aunt's face. She slipped out the side door and walked quickly down Main Street, not caring that it was improper for a lady to be walking alone as dusk fell. She found herself at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to wilderness. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and mysterious in the fading light. Somewhere out there, Ethan Thorn was probably making camp, free and wild and answerable to no one. Running away or just thinking about it, Penelope gasped and spun around. Ethan stepped out from the shadow of a large pine tree, and she wondered how long he had been there watching her. You startled me, she said, pressing a hand to her racing heart. Sorry, did not mean to. He walked closer, and in the dim light he looked even larger, more imposing. But Penelope did not feel afraid. She felt strangely safer than she had all evening. You were at the church social. How did you know? Saw you walking. You looked upset. Penelope laughed, but it came out bitter. Upset? Yes, I suppose that is one word for it. What happened? She should not tell him. It was none of his business. She barely knew him. But something about the quiet concern in his voice, the way he stood there waiting for her answer without pushing, made the words tumble out. I received a proposal tonight. Gerald Whitmore, the banker. He offered me a satisfactory arrangement where I would keep his house and warm his bed, and in return I would have security and should be grateful for it. Ethan's expression darkened. You love him? No. You want to marry him? No. Then why are you considering it? Because I have no choice. The words burst out of her, sharp with frustration. Because I am poor and plain and dependent on my aunt's charity, and she has made it clear that if I refuse him, I am on my own. Because this is what women in my position do. We marry for security, not love, and we should be grateful that anyone wants us at all. She was breathing hard, dangerously close to tears. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, then he stepped closer, so close she had to tilt her head back to look at him. You want to know what I see when I look at you, he said, his voice low and intense. I see a woman who is strong and smart and beautiful. I see someone who deserves to be chosen, not settled for. Someone who should wake up every morning knowing she is wanted, not just convenient. Penelope's breath caught. You do not know me. Maybe not yet, but I know enough. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with surprising gentleness. You deserve better than a satisfactory arrangement, Penelope Darrow. "And what do I deserve?" she whispered. "Everything," he said simply. "You deserve everything." They stood there in the gathering darkness, and Penelope felt something fundamental shift inside her. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, saw her not as a burden or an obligation or a convenient solution to loneliness. He saw her as someone valuable, someone worth choosing. "I have to give him an answer Wednesday," she said quietly. "Then I have until Wednesday to convince you there are other options." "What options?" "I have no money. No family who cares for me. No prospects." Ethan's hand was still near her face, and he traced his thumb along her cheekbone with heartbreaking tenderness. "You have me if you want me. I do not have much a cabin up in the high country, some land I am claiming, enough skill to make a living from trapping and hunting. It is a hard life, Penelope. Lonely sometimes. But I would never make you feel like you should be grateful I chose you. I would spend every day grateful you chose me." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. "You cannot mean this. You barely know me." "I know enough," he repeated. "I know that the first time I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. I know that I have been wandering these mountains for 10 years, never finding a reason to settle, and then I walked into a store in Lewiston, and suddenly I had a reason." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "I know that, when I think about my future now, you are in it. And I know that is crazy and too fast and probably foolish, but it is true." "Ethan, you do not have to decide now," he said. "But before you accept that banker and his satisfactory arrangement, spend some time with me. Let me show you what choosing looks like instead of settling." Penelope knew she should say no. She should be sensible and practical and think about security. But when had being sensible ever made her feel the way she felt right now, with this mountain man looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life? "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Ethan's smile was slow and warm and made her knees weak. "Come riding with me tomorrow. I will show you the high country, the places where the world is still wild and beautiful. Then you can decide what kind of life you want. My aunt will never allow it." "Then do not ask permission. Meet me at dawn at the north edge of town where the trail heads up into the mountains. Just a few hours, Penelope. Give me that much." She should say no. It was improper, dangerous, exactly the kind of reckless behavior her aunt had warned her against. "Dawn," she said. "I will be there." Penelope barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle and her aunt snoring from the room below, and wondered if she had lost her mind. She was planning to sneak out to meet a man she barely knew, to ride unchaperoned into the mountains, to risk everything on the basis of a feeling she could not explain. But when dawn broke, she was dressed in her oldest, most practical dress, with her hair braided and pinned securely. She crept down the stairs, avoiding the third step that always creaked, and slipped out the back door while Aunt Constance still slept. The town was quiet in the early morning light, the storefronts still shuttered, the streets empty except for a stray dog nosing through garbage. Penelope walked quickly to the north edge of town, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Ethan was waiting for her, holding the reins of 2 horses, a large bay gelding for himself, and a smaller chestnut mare for her. He smiled when he saw her, and the warmth in his expression chased away her doubts. "Was not sure you would come," he said. "I was not sure either," she admitted. He helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, and then swung up onto his own horse with fluid grace. "We will follow the trail about 5 miles up, to a meadow I found last week. Most beautiful place I have seen in all my travels. Wanted to share it with you." They rode out of Lewiston as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The trail climbed steadily through pine forest, the air growing cooler and cleaner with altitude. Penelope had been on horseback before, but never like this, riding not to accomplish an errand, but simply for the joy of movement and freedom. Ethan was a careful guide, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the animals they might see: deer, elk, maybe even a bear if they were lucky, though he assured her the bears were more interested in avoiding humans than confronting them. He talked about his life in the mountains, the seasons of trapping and hunting, the peace he found in solitude. "Why did you come down to Lewiston?" Penelope asked as they paused to let the horses drink from a creek. "If you love the wild so much, why come to town at all?" "Needed supplies," he said, "and I had been alone a long time. Started thinking maybe it was time to see if I could find a reason to be around people again." He looked at her directly. "Then I found one." The meadow he had promised appeared after another mile of riding, and Penelope caught her breath at the sight. It was a perfect bowl of green grass dotted with wildflowers: purple lupine, yellow balsamroot, white and pink columbine. A small waterfall tumbled down the rocks at the far end, feeding a clear pool. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still touched with snow despite the spring warmth. "Ethan," she breathed, "this is incredible. Thought you might like it." He dismounted and came to help her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Come on. There is more to see." He led her to the pool at the base of the waterfall, where the water was so clear she could see smooth stones on the bottom. They sat on a flat rock warmed by the sun, and Ethan pulled out a simple lunch he had packed: bread, cheese, dried apples, and a canteen of water. They ate in comfortable silence, and Penelope realized how rare this was to be with someone and not feel pressured to fill every moment with conversation. With her aunt, silence was always weighted with disapproval. With Gerald Whitmore it had been awkward and uncomfortable, but with Ethan it felt natural, like they were two parts of the same quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Anything." "Why me?" "You could have any woman you wanted. Someone prettier, someone with money or family connections. Why choose someone like me?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he turned to face her fully. "You want the truth, always. That first day when I walked into the store, I saw you standing there with your back straight and your chin up, even though I could tell you were tired and sad and carrying weight that was not yours to carry. And I thought, there is a fighter. There is someone who has not given up, even when it would be easier to just let the world break her." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Then you talked to me like I was a person, not just a customer or a convenience. You have no idea how rare that is. Most people in towns like this, they look at men like me and see something dangerous or dirty, something to be used when needed and avoided otherwise. But you looked at me like I mattered." "You do matter," Penelope said softly. "So do you. That is what I am trying to tell you." His green eyes were intense, burning with emotion. "I have been alone a long time, Penelope. I have gotten good at it. But then I met you, and suddenly alone felt like the wrong way to be. You make me want things I stopped wanting years ago. A home that is more than just a cabin. A future that is more than just surviving the next winter. Someone to share the sunrises with." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. "I am afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of this. Of wanting something so much and then losing it. Of trusting you and being wrong. Of giving up the safety Gerald Whitmore offers for something that might not last." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "I cannot promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. Life is hard, especially out here. But I can promise you that I will never make you feel like you should be grateful I want you. I can promise that every day I will choose you. Not because you are convenient or because I need a housekeeper or because you are the best option available, but because you are you, and that is enough. More than enough. How can you be so sure? She asked. We have known each other less than a week. Some things you just know. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so tender it made her heart ache. But if you need more time, I will give it to you. If you need me to prove myself, I will do it. Whatever you need, Penelope. I am not going anywhere. They sat there by the waterfall as the sun climbed higher, and Penelope felt something inside her unfurl, like a plant that had been kept in darkness finally reaching toward light. This man, this strong, capable, gentle man, was offering her something she had never dared hope for, a real choice. Not an obligation or a duty, but a genuine possibility for happiness. I need to tell you something, she said, about why my aunt is so insistent I marry Gerald Whitmore. All right. When my parents died, they left debts. My aunt paid them, but she has never let me forget it. Every day she reminds me that I owe her, that I am a burden. She wants me to marry Mr. Whitmore because then I will be his responsibility instead of hers. She does not care if I am happy, only that I am taken care of so she can be free of me. Anger flashed across Ethan's face. That is no way to treat family. I know, but it is the reality of my situation. If I refuse Mr. Whitmore, my aunt will turn me out. I will have nothing. You will have me, Ethan said firmly. If you want me, you will have me and everything I can give you. It is not much by town standards, no fancy house, no social standing. But you will have a home, Penelope. A real home where you are wanted for who you are, not what you can provide. Penelope looked at him, this mountain man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had been too afraid to speak aloud. I want that, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I want you, but I am terrified. Then be terrified, he said. But be terrified while moving forward, not while standing still in a life that is killing you by inches. He was right. She knew he was right. Life with Gerald Whitmore would be safe and suffocating, a slow death of the spirit. Life with Ethan would be uncertain and challenging, but it would be alive. It would be hers. What would I have to do? She asked. If I chose you instead of Mr. Whitmore, pack what matters to you, say your goodbyes or do not, depending on who deserves them. Meet me at the cabin, I will give you directions. We will go to the preacher and get married proper, if that is what you want. Or we can live together without the paperwork. I do not care about convention as much as I care about building a life with you. Whatever makes you comfortable. I want to get married, Penelope said. I want it to be real and legal and permanent. Ethan's smile was brilliant. Then that is what we will do. When? I have to give Mr. Whitmore my answer Wednesday. Can we do it before then? Tomorrow, if you want. There is a preacher in the next valley over, about a day's ride. We could leave tonight, be married by tomorrow afternoon, and be back to my cabin by Wednesday. You would never have to face Whitmore or your aunt again if you did not want to. It was insane. Reckless. Everything she had been raised not to do. But Penelope felt more certain of this decision than she had felt about anything in her entire life. Yes, she said. Let us do it. Let us get married tomorrow. Ethan pulled her into his arms, and Penelope went willingly, pressing her face against his broad chest. She could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek, and his arms around her felt like the safest place in the world. You will not regret this, he murmured into her hair. I swear to you, Penelope, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. She pulled back enough to look up at him. I am choosing you, she said, not settling, not accepting the best option available, choosing you because you make me feel like I matter. Ethan cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, and Penelope saw her own emotion reflected in his eyes, hope and wonder and the first blooming of love. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, she breathed. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Penelope met him halfway. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, the kiss tender and searching. It was nothing like the wet, grasping kiss Gerald Whitmore had forced on her once in the store stockroom. This was different. This was Ethan asking a question and Penelope answering with her whole heart. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "We should head back," he said reluctantly. "You will need time to pack, and I need to make arrangements for the journey." The ride back to Lewiston felt different than the ride out. Penelope was no longer running from something. She was moving toward something, toward a future she had chosen, toward a man who saw her as valuable and worthy and enough. Ethan left her at the edge of town with detailed instructions on how to find his cabin and what to bring. "Pack light," he said. "Only what matters. We can get anything else you need later." "I do not have much anyway," Penelope said. Most of what she owned belonged to her aunt anyway, the dresses, the shoes, even the hairbrush she used. "Tonight, after your aunt is asleep, come to the cabin. It is about 3 miles north, up the trail we rode today, then east when you see the lightning-struck pine. You will see the smoke from my fire. Can you manage that?" "I can manage," Penelope said, feeling braver than she ever had before. "If you change your mind, I will not change my mind." Ethan smiled and leaned down from his horse to kiss her once more, this time with more confidence, more promise. "Until tonight, then." Penelope walked back to the store in a daze. Her aunt was behind the counter, her expression thunderous. "Where have you been?" Aunt Constance demanded. "The store should have opened an hour ago. Mrs. Henderson was here looking for thread and I had to tell her to come back later. Do you have any idea how that looks?" "I went for a walk," Penelope said. "I needed to think." "Think? You do not get paid to think. You get room and board in exchange for work, and you are failing to uphold your end of the arrangement." Her aunt's eyes narrowed. "This is about Mr. Whitmore's proposal, is it not? You are being difficult." "I am not being difficult. I am trying to make a decision about my entire future." "There is nothing to decide. You will accept him. End of discussion." Aunt Constance turned back to her ledger. "Now go dust the shelves. We have wasted enough time today." Penelope spent the rest of the day in a haze of nervous energy, alternating between terror and exhilaration. She went through the motions of work, helping customers and sweeping floors, while her mind raced ahead to the night, to Ethan's cabin, to the journey they would take tomorrow. When she went up to her attic room that night, she pulled out the small carpet bag that had been her mother's and began packing. She did not have much worth taking a few changes of underclothings, a spare dress, the locket her mother had given her on her 16th birthday, a small leather-bound journal where she had been keeping accounts and observations for years. She wrapped these few precious items carefully and set the bag by her narrow window. She waited until she heard her aunt snoring before she moved. The house was dark and quiet as she crept down the stairs, her bag clutched in one hand. She paused at the door to her aunt's room, feeling a strange pang. For all of Aunt Constance's harshness, she was still family. But then Penelope remembered all the times her aunt had made her feel small and worthless, all the constant reminders of her debt and her burden, and the pang faded. She left no note. What was there to say? Her aunt would understand soon enough when Gerald Whitmore came calling and found Penelope gone. The night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. Penelope walked quickly through the sleeping town, following the trail Ethan had shown her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it was excitement now more than fear. She was doing this. She was choosing her own life. The lightning-struck pine was exactly where Ethan had said it would be, a stark silhouette against the starlit sky. Penelope turned east and saw the glow of firelight through the trees. She emerged into a clearing, and there was the cabin, small and sturdy, built of solid logs with a stone chimney from which smoke curled lazily upward. The door opened before she could knock, and Ethan stepped out, backlit by the fire inside. "You came," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "Did you think I would not? Hoped you would. Was not sure." He took her bag and ushered her inside. The cabin was simple but well kept. One large room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table and chairs, a bed in one corner covered with furs and wool blankets. Shelves held supplies and equipment, traps, rope, ammunition, books. It was sparse but clean, a place built for function rather than comfort. "It is not much," Ethan said, watching her anxiously. "But it is warm and dry, and I can add on to it as needed. Maybe build a separate room for whatever we might need in the future." Penelope understood what he was not saying. A room for children if they were blessed with them. The thought sent a flutter of nerves and anticipation through her. "It is perfect," she said honestly. "It is more than I ever hoped to have." Ethan set her bag down carefully. "You can have the bed tonight. I will sleep by the fire." "Ethan, we are not married yet," he said gently. "I know we are doing things quickly, but I want to do some things right. Tomorrow, after the preacher says his words, then we will share a bed. But tonight, you are still Penelope Darrow, and I am going to treat you with the respect you deserve." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. Every time she thought she could not possibly care for this man more, he did something that cracked her heart open wider. "Thank you," she whispered. They talked late into the night, feeding the fire and learning about each other. Ethan told her about growing up in a small town in Montana, about losing his parents to illness when he was 16, about heading into the mountains because he could not bear the pitying looks from neighbors who saw him as a charity case. He talked about learning to trap and hunt, about nearly starving his first winter until an old mountain man named Bear took him under his wing and taught him how to survive. Penelope told him about her childhood in Oregon, about her father's work as a clerk and her mother's gentle nature, about the fever that had taken them both within days of each other. She talked about coming to live with Aunt Constance, about the gradual erosion of her spirit under constant criticism and obligation. "You are not going back there," Ethan said firmly when she fell silent. "Even if you change your mind about me, you are not going back to that woman. I will help you find work somewhere else, set you up with references, whatever you need. Promise me you will not go back to that." "I promise," Penelope said, "but I am not changing my mind about you." When she finally lay down in Ethan's bed, surrounded by the scent of pine and wood smoke and something that was uniquely him, she felt safer than she had in years. She fell asleep listening to his steady breathing by the fire and dreamed of wildflower meadows and mountain peaks. They left before dawn, riding double on Ethan's big bay gelding with their few supplies strapped behind the saddle. The journey to the next valley was long but beautiful, the trail winding through dense forest and across high meadows. Ethan pointed out animal tracks and told her stories about the land, his voice a soothing rumble against her back where she leaned against him. They reached the small settlement of Clearwater by mid-afternoon. It was even smaller than Lewiston, just a handful of buildings clustered around a creek. The preacher was a weathered man named Reverend Walsh who asked no questions when Ethan explained they wanted to be married. "You are both of age and willing?" he asked. "Yes, sir," they answered together. "Then I see no reason to wait. Do you have a witness?" Ethan looked around and spotted a woman hanging laundry behind one of the houses. "Madam, sorry to bother you, but we need a witness for our wedding. Could you spare a few minutes?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Cooper, was delighted. "A wedding? How wonderful! Of course I will witness." "Let me just get my daughter," She loves weddings. So Penelope Darrow married Ethan Thorn on a sunny April afternoon in 1876, standing in front of a small wooden church with a preacher, a farmer's wife, and a wide-eyed 10-year-old girl as their only attendees. Penelope wore her plain brown dress, and Ethan wore his buckskins, and when the reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with such tenderness that Mrs. Cooper sighed and her daughter giggled. "You are mine now," Ethan murmured against Penelope's lips, "and I am yours." "No going back." "No going back," Penelope agreed, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They spent their wedding night in the cabin they had passed on the way to Clearwater, Ethan having arranged to rent it for the evening. It was not much, just a trapper's shelter, really, but Mrs. Cooper had insisted on bringing them a basket of food and fresh linens, declaring that every bride deserved something special on her wedding night. Penelope was nervous as the sun set, and Ethan lit candles around the small space. She had only the vaguest idea of what happened between husband and wife, gleaned from overheard conversations and vague warnings from her aunt about wifely duties. Ethan seemed to sense her nervousness. He took her hand gently and led her to sit on the edge of the bed. "We do not have to do anything tonight," he said softly. "We have all the time in the world." "I want to," Penelope said, her cheeks flaming. "I am just nervous. I do not know what to expect. Then let me show you." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her slowly, thoroughly, until she felt her nervousness begin to melt into something warmer, more insistent. His hands were gentle as he helped her out of her dress, his touch reverent as he explored the body she was offering him. Penelope discovered that her husband was a patient teacher, taking his time to show her what brought pleasure, asking what felt good, moving slowly until her nervousness transformed into wonder, and then into gasping need. When he finally joined his body to hers, there was a moment of discomfort, but Ethan held still, whispering reassurances and kissing away the single tear that escaped down her cheek. Then the discomfort faded, and there was only the overwhelming intimacy of being this close to another person, of giving and receiving in the most fundamental way. Afterward, Penelope lay in her husband's arms, her head on his broad chest, listening to his heart slow from its gallop to a steady rhythm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Better than all right," she said honestly. "I never knew it could be like that. My aunt always made it sound like something to endure, not enjoy." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "With me, it will always be something to enjoy. I promise you that." They made love again in the deep hours of night, slower this time, with more confidence on Penelope's part. She discovered that she loved the feel of his muscles under her hands, the way his breath caught when she touched him in certain places, the low rumble of pleasure he made deep in his chest. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the narrow bed, Penelope felt complete in a way she never had before. This was what it meant to be chosen, she thought drowsily. This was what it felt like to matter. They returned to Ethan's cabin the next day, arriving in the late afternoon. Penelope felt different not just because she was now a married woman, but because she was beginning to see herself through Ethan's eyes. Not as a burden or an obligation, but as someone valuable and worthy of love. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that Penelope found deeply satisfying. She learned the rhythms of mountain life, how to preserve meat, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals. Ethan was an excellent teacher, patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise when she succeeded. He taught her to shoot, setting up targets and standing behind her to help her sight down the barrel of his rifle. "You need to know how to protect yourself when I am out checking traps," he said. "The mountains are beautiful, but they can be dangerous too." Penelope proved to be a decent shot, much to Ethan's delight. "You are a natural," he said after she hit 3 targets in a row. "Better than me when I was starting out." She learned to cook over an open fire and in the cabin's fireplace, experimenting with the ingredients they had on hand. Some meals were disasters. She would never forget the stew that was so salty even the dog that sometimes visited from a neighboring claim refused to eat it. But Ethan ate it anyway, choking it down with a smile and declaring it was not that bad, really. "You are a terrible liar," Penelope said, watching him drink half a canteen of water to wash it down. "Maybe, but I am your terrible liar now." He pulled her into his lap and kissed her soundly. "Besides, you are getting better. That bread you made yesterday was delicious." In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, or Ethan would read aloud from one of the books on his shelf, mostly adventure stories, and some poetry that surprised Penelope. "You did not strike me as a poetry reader," she said one night as he closed a volume of Wordsworth. "Bear, the old trapper who taught me to survive, he loved poetry. Said it reminded him that humans were capable of creating beauty, not just destruction. He would recite it while we were skinning pelts or checking trap lines. I thought he was crazy at first, but it grew on me." Penelope snuggled closer to his side, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the solid strength of her husband beside her. "Read me some more." So Ethan read to her about daffodils and wandering clouds, his deep voice turning the words into music. Penelope closed her eyes and let herself feel the simple contentment of the moment: a warm fire, a full belly, a good man who wanted her exactly as she was. It was not all idyllic, of course. There were hard days when the work seemed endless, when the isolation of mountain life pressed in on Penelope, and she missed the bustle of town. There were times when Ethan was gone for 2 or 3 days checking his trap lines, and Penelope had to manage alone, listening to every creak and rustle in the darkness and fighting down panic. But Ethan always came back, usually with fresh meat or pelts to sell, and his joy at seeing her made the lonely hours worth it. He would sweep her into his arms and kiss her like he had been gone for months instead of days, and Penelope would feel her world settle back into place. They had been married about a month when Penelope realized she had not had her monthly courses since before the wedding. At first, she thought it was just the stress of the changes in her life, but when another week passed and she started feeling queasy in the mornings, she began to suspect the truth. She was sitting outside the cabin one afternoon, mending one of Ethan's shirts, when he emerged from the woods with a string of rabbits. He took one look at her face and dropped the rabbits. "What is wrong?" he asked, immediately on alert. "Are you sick? Hurt?" "No, I am fine." "Actually, I think I might be pregnant." Ethan went very still. "You think?" "I am fairly certain. All the signs are there." She set down the mending and looked up at him anxiously. "Are you upset? I know we did not plan this so soon." "Upset?" Ethan's face split into the widest smile she had ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing. "Penelope, I am the opposite of upset. I am thrilled. Terrified, but thrilled." He set her down gently, his hands immediately going to her still flat stomach. "There is a baby in there." "Our baby. If I am right, yes. It is still very early, so we should not count on it completely, but I think so." Ethan dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his forehead against her belly. "Hello in there, little one," he said softly. "I am your father, and I already love you more than I thought possible." Penelope stroked his hair, her heart so full it hurt. This man, this wonderful man who had chosen her and kept on choosing her every single day. "We are going to need to add that extra room sooner than I thought," Ethan said, looking up at her with shining eyes. "And I will need to bring in more pelts, save up money for when the baby comes. We will need supplies, blankets, maybe find someone who can help when it is time for the birth. Ethan, Penelope interrupted gently. We have months to prepare. Right now, just be happy with me. So he stood and pulled her into his arms, and they swayed together in the afternoon sunlight, dreaming about the future they were building. The months that followed were busy but joyful. Ethan threw himself into preparations, adding a small bedroom onto the cabin and stocking up on supplies for the winter and the baby's arrival. Penelope sewed baby clothes from scraps of fabric Ethan bought on his trips to town, her hands creating tiny gowns and blankets. She did think occasionally about Aunt Constance, wondering if her disappearance had caused a scandal, wondering if Gerald Whitmore had been angry or just relieved. But she did not regret her choice. How could she, when every day with Ethan was proof that she had made the right decision? In her 6th month of pregnancy, when the summer heat was at its peak and Penelope felt like a whale, Ethan came back from a trip to Lewiston with news. "Your aunt is gone," he said without preamble. "Sold the store and moved back east. Mrs. Cooper at the general store told me apparently your aunt could not stand the gossip after you left. The whole town was talking about you running off with the mountain man." Penelope waited for the guilt to hit, but it did not come. Instead, she felt only a distant sort of relief. That chapter of her life was closed now, completely and finally. "What about Mr. Whitmore?" she asked. "Married a widow from Boise about a month after you left. Seems he was more interested in having a wife than in having you specifically." Ethan sat down beside her and took her hand. "Any regrets?" Penelope looked around the cabin at the cradle Ethan had carved by hand, at the garden she had planted that was now flourishing, at the bookshelf, where her journal sat next to his adventure novels. She looked at her husband, at his strong, kind face and the love that shone so clearly in his eyes. "Not a single one," she said. "This is exactly where I want to be." Their son was born on a cold December night, coming into the world with a lusty cry that made both parents laugh through their tears. Ethan had ridden down to Clearwater 2 weeks before and convinced Mrs. Cooper to come stay with them for the birth, and the older woman proved invaluable, guiding Penelope through the hours of labor with calm competence. When Penelope finally held her son in her arms, she felt a love so fierce it was almost frightening. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Ethan sat beside her on the bed, his large finger gripped in the baby's tiny fist, and Penelope had never seen him look so awed. "What should we name him?" she asked. "Whatever you want," Ethan said, unable to take his eyes off his son. They decided on James, after Penelope's father, with the middle name William after Bear, the old trapper who had taught Ethan to survive in the mountains. James William Thorn, their perfect boy. Those first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Penelope learned to function on broken sleep, to nurse while doing a dozen other tasks, to interpret the different meanings of James's cries. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with the baby in the middle of the night, singing rough lullabies in his deep voice, changing diapers without complaint. "You are good at this," Penelope said one night, watching him rock James to sleep. "I have good motivation," Ethan replied, looking down at their son with such tenderness it made Penelope's heart ache. "Want to give him the best life possible. Want him to grow up knowing he was wanted and loved and chosen. Chosen. That word again." Penelope understood now, in a way she had not before, what it meant to choose and be chosen. She had chosen Ethan over safety and security. He had chosen her over solitude and independence. And together, they were choosing to build a life filled with love instead of settling for one of mere survival. James was 2 years old, toddling around the cabin and getting into everything, when Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with equal joy but less terror. They knew what to expect now, and they had proven they could handle it. Their daughter, Elizabeth Rose Thorn, was born in the spring of 1879, a quiet baby who seemed to study the world with solemn dark eyes. James was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything and showering her with sloppy toddler kisses. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier now with 2 children but no less satisfying. Ethan's trapping business had grown successful, and he had started guiding hunting parties in the fall, which brought in extra money. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Penelope sometimes thought about the life she could have had as Mrs. Gerald Whitmore. She would have had a bigger house, finer clothes, social standing in Lewiston. But she would not have had this, would not have had mornings waking up in Ethan's arms, or afternoons watching her children play in the meadow, or evenings sitting by the fire feeling completely content. She would not have had a husband who looked at her every day like she was the answer to all his prayers. She would not have had someone who made her feel chosen instead of settled for. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked one evening. They were sitting outside, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink while the children napped inside. "About how lucky I am," Penelope said honestly. "About how different my life could have been if you had not walked into that store 3 years ago." Ethan pulled her closer against his side. "I think about that too sometimes. Think about how I almost did not stop in Lewiston that day. I was just going to ride through, head further into the mountains. Then something made me stop, made me walk into that store. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was just luck. Either way, I am grateful." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, and Penelope felt the rightness of this moment settle into her bones. This was what she had been meant for, not dutiful service as someone's convenient wife, but this partnership, this love, this life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination. "I love you," she said, turning to look at Ethan. "I do not say it enough, but I love you so much." "I love you too," he said, his green eyes soft in the fading light. "Every day, Penelope. Every single day I wake up and choose you all over again, and I will keep choosing you until the day I die. And I will keep choosing you," she promised. Inside the cabin, one of the children began to cry, and they both stood, ready to face whatever came next. Together. Always together. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James grew tall and strong like his father, learning to trap and hunt almost as soon as he could walk. Elizabeth was quieter, more thoughtful, with a gift for sketching that Penelope nurtured by trading pelts for paper and pencils. When James was 7 and Elizabeth was 5, Penelope gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Samuel and Daniel. The cabin that had seemed so spacious when Penelope first arrived now felt cramped. So Ethan spent that summer building a larger house, with separate bedrooms for the children and a proper kitchen for Penelope. "You have given me 4 children," he said as they stood looking at the finished structure. "The least I can do is give you a house where you do not have to cook, sleep, and live all in one room." The new house was beautiful in its simplicity, solid log construction, large windows to let in light, a wraparound porch where Penelope could sit and watch the children play. It had a real iron stove for cooking, shelves for books and supplies, and enough space for their growing family. Neighbors had started to move into the area, other families drawn by the good hunting and the rich land. There was talk of building a schoolhouse, of organizing a proper church. The wilderness was being tamed, slowly but surely, but Penelope did not mind. She had her wild places, still the meadow where Ethan had first brought her, the creek where they had first kissed, the mountains that surrounded their home, and she had Ethan, who still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. Their lives were not perfect. There were lean years when the trapping was poor and money was tight. There was the winter when Elizabeth caught pneumonia and they nearly lost her, Penelope and Ethan taking turns staying awake to watch over her feverish sleep. There was the spring flood that destroyed half their garden and the summer fire that came dangerously close to their property. But they faced everything together, and somehow that made even the hardest times bearable. Ethan was her partner in every sense, sharing the work, sharing the worry, sharing the joy. He never made her feel like the children were solely her responsibility or that her work was less valuable than his. They were a team, building a life side by side. When Penelope was 35, she realized she was pregnant for the 5th time. She was surprised the twins were already 10, and she had thought her childbearing years might be over. But Ethan was delighted, declaring that their house could always make room for one more. Their final child, a daughter they named Catherine Grace, was born in the autumn of 1889. She had Ethan's green eyes and Penelope's dark hair, and from the moment she arrived, she had the entire family wrapped around her tiny finger. "Our last baby," Penelope said softly one night, holding Catherine while the older children slept. "How do you know she is the last?" Ethan asked, though he was smiling. "I am 35. The odds of another pregnancy are getting smaller, and honestly, I think 5 might be enough." She looked down at Catherine's peaceful sleeping face. "Though she is awfully perfect." "She had a good example," Ethan said, pulling Penelope and the baby close. "Her mother set the bar pretty high for perfection." Even after 13 years of marriage, compliments from Ethan could still make Penelope blush. "You are biased." "Absolutely, but I am also right." He kissed the top of her head. "You have given me everything, Penelope. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning feeling grateful. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for it every day." "You did not have to do anything," Penelope said. "You just had to be you. That was always enough." The children grew and flourished. James, at 18, had started his own trapping line and was courting a girl from one of the neighboring homesteads. Elizabeth, at 16, had been offered a scholarship to a school in Boise for young artists. And though it had been hard to let her go, Penelope and Ethan had encouraged her to pursue her talent. The twins, at 13, were hellions who kept Penelope constantly on her toes but also made her laugh every day with their antics. And Catherine, at 4, was the baby of the family, spoiled and adored by her older siblings. Penelope and Ethan had built something here in the mountains, not just a house or a family, but a legacy of love and choice and determination. Their children knew they were wanted, knew they were valuable, knew that love was something you chose every day, not just something that happened to you. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Penelope back to the meadow where he had first told her she deserved everything. It was early summer, and the wildflowers were in full bloom, just as they had been that long-ago day. "Do you remember?" he asked, holding her hand as they stood in the middle of the sea of color. "Every moment," Penelope said. "I was so scared, so certain I was making a terrible mistake." And now she turned to look at him. He was 43 now, his hair starting to show threads of silver, lines around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun. But he was still the same man who had walked into a general store in Lewiston and seen her, really seen her, when no one else bothered to look. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made," she said. "Choosing you over security, choosing love over settling, choosing to believe I deserved more than just being grateful for any proposal given." Ethan cupped her face in his hands, those rough, capable hands that had built their home and held their children and touched her with unwavering tenderness for 15 years. "You made me believe I deserved more too," he said. "Before you, I thought I was meant to be alone. Thought maybe that was just who I was, the mountain man who lived on the edges of civilization. But you showed me I could be more, could be a husband, a father, a partner. You gave me a reason to be more." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and possibility, and Penelope felt the same flutter of excitement she had felt at 18, at 22, at every age in between and since. This was what it meant to be truly chosen, she thought. Not just once, in a dramatic moment of decision, but every day, in 1,000 small ways. The years continued to roll by, marked by weddings and grandchildren, and the slow, steady accumulation of a life well lived. James married his sweetheart and built a house on land adjacent to theirs. Elizabeth came home from art school and set up a studio in town, where she painted landscapes that people came from miles around to purchase. The twins eventually settled down, Samuel becoming a guide like his father and Daniel opening a general store in what was now the growing town of Clearwater. Catherine, their baby, surprised everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to be a doctor. Ethan and Penelope scrimped and saved to send her to medical school in San Francisco, and when she graduated at the top of her class, they were there to watch, bursting with pride. Penelope was 53 when Ethan had his accident. He was out checking trap lines with Samuel, and a rock slide caught them both off guard. Samuel escaped with minor injuries, but a boulder had pinned Ethan's leg, crushing it badly. Dr. Ethan Thorn, now 24 and newly returned from San Francisco, set the leg with skill and care, but she could not hide the worry in her eyes when she spoke to Penelope privately. "The bone is badly shattered," Catherine said. "I have done what I can, but he may never walk properly again. And there is a risk of infection always." Penelope sat by Ethan's bedside for 3 weeks, watching for signs of fever, changing bandages, feeding him broth and tea and whatever else she could coax down his throat. The children took turns helping, but mostly it was just the two of them, like it had been in the beginning. "You should be resting," Ethan said one afternoon, his voice still weak from pain and medication. "Not sitting here watching me sleep. Where else would I be?" Penelope replied, taking his hand. "This is where I choose to be." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. 31 years, he said softly. 31 years you have been choosing me, even now when I am broken and useless." "Stop," Penelope said firmly. "You are not useless. You are healing. And I am not here out of obligation, Ethan. I am here because I love you, because you are my partner, my best friend, my heart, because I still choose you every single day." Tears slipped down Ethan's weathered cheeks. "I am afraid," he admitted. "Afraid I will not be able to provide for you anymore. Afraid I will be a burden instead of a help." Penelope leaned over and kissed him gently. "You have been providing for me for 31 years. You have given me a home, a family, a life filled with love. If it is my turn to take care of you for a while, then that is what I will do. That is what partners do. They take turns carrying each other." Ethan did recover, though Catherine had been right about his leg. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and could no longer manage the long trap lines through the mountains. But he adapted, focusing instead on guiding hunting parties from horseback and teaching his grandchildren the skills he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Penelope watched him with his grandchildren and saw the same patience and gentleness he had shown their own children. He made each of them feel special, chosen, valuable. He taught them not just how to survive in the mountains, but how to live with integrity and kindness. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered at the house for a celebration. All 5 children were there, along with their spouses, and a dozen grandchildren ranging in age from infant to teenager. The house was filled with noise and laughter and life, exactly the way Penelope loved it. As the evening drew to a close, and the family began to drift toward their own homes, Ethan pulled Penelope out onto the porch. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. 40 years, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. 40 years since I walked into that store and saw you. Best decision you ever made, Penelope teased. Second best, Ethan corrected. Best decision was asking you to choose me instead of settling for that banker. Penelope leaned back against his solid chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. You did not ask me to choose you. You showed me that I was worth choosing. There is a difference. Is there? Yes. If you had just asked, I might have been trading one obligation for another, but you made me see that I had value, that I deserved to be wanted for who I was, not what I could provide. You changed how I saw myself, Ethan. That is why I chose you. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he turned her in his arms so they were face to face. His hair was fully silver now, his face deeply lined, but his green eyes still held the same warmth and love they had 40 years ago. I would choose you again, he said. If I had to do it all over, if I had 1,000 lifetimes, I would choose you every single time. And I would choose you, Penelope whispered, tears streaming down her face. Always you. They stood there as the sun set and the stars came out. Two people who had built a life on the foundation of being chosen rather than settled for. They had faced hardship and joy, loss and gain, all the complicated messiness of a life fully lived. And through it all, they had chosen each other. Every single day, years later, when Penelope was 70 and Ethan was 71, they would sit on this same porch and watch their great-grandchildren play in the meadow. They would hold hands and remember that long-ago spring when a mountain man walked into a general store and saw a woman who thought she should be grateful for any proposal given. And Penelope would thank God that she had been brave enough to believe she deserved more. Brave enough to choose love over security, passion over practicality, a life of being truly chosen over a life of mere settlement. That meadow where Ethan had first taken her still bloomed with wildflowers every spring, and sometimes they would ride out there together, moving more slowly now but no less determined. They would sit in the same spot where he had first told her she deserved everything, and they would marvel at how far they had come. No regrets, Ethan would ask, though he knew the answer. Not a single one, Penelope would reply. You, only that I did not find you sooner. But they had found each other in the end, and that was what mattered. They had built a legacy not of wealth or status but of love freely given and gratefully received. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry that legacy forward, understanding that being chosen was a gift to be treasured, not an obligation to be endured. Ethan Thorn died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Penelope holding his hand. Their children and grandchildren filled the house, saying their goodbyes to the man who had taught them what it meant to love well and choose wisely. Penelope grieved deeply, but without regret. She had been given 49 years with the man she loved, 49 years of being chosen and cherished and valued. Not everyone got that, she knew. Some people lived their entire lives without knowing what it felt like to matter to someone else. She lived another 5 years after Ethan's passing, surrounded by family, tending the garden she had planted 5 decades earlier, sitting on the porch watching the mountains change with the seasons. And when her time came, she went peacefully, with her children around her and no fear in her heart. Her last words were simple. I am going to find your father. Tell him I chose him again. They buried her next to Ethan on a hill overlooking the meadow, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. And if you visit that meadow in the spring when the wildflowers are in bloom, you can almost feel it, the echo of a love that refused to settle, that demanded to be chosen, that changed two lives and created a legacy that would last for generations. Because that is what real love does. It does not ask you to be grateful for scraps. It does not make you feel like you should settle. It makes you feel chosen every single day in 1,000 different ways. And that, Penelope Darrow Thorn would have told you, makes all the difference.